Told you last time that we were going to go to the book of Nehemiah. We're not. And here's the reason, because if you go back to this timeline, I told you when we were on the timeline, I'm not going to go over it again. We've done it. But when we got to this part right here, look at this. In 520 BC, there was an event that occurred, and God sent two prophets into the promised land to like I said last time, to crack the skulls of the stubborn Jews in Judah, in Jerusalem, to get them moving on the rebuilding of the temple again. Things had stalled, and God called out these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, and I want to talk about these two guys before we get out of this, before we get off of this timeline, since we're here, since it's in the time, Nehemiah would push us out of this timeline another 60 or 70 years forward. So I want to stay here for just a minute and talk about Haggai tonight. Haggai. I told you that these two men were prophets that were sent by Yahweh to get the Jews back to work on the temple. Like I said, the process, the progress of rebuilding the temple had altogether stalled. And we're going to talk about some reasons why. I would wonder if any of you have any ideas why Israel, after coming back into the promised land, being told by Cyrus, you may go back and God has appointed me to have you rebuild your temple. Why is it that Israel didn't rebuild the temple? Why didn't they get the work done? I wonder if you have any ideas. This is the promise that we're going to be chasing today. Just to give you a date, look at what just popped up there. In 520 BC, this is Haggai and Zechariah going back into the land, and it was 5 years later. We talked about this at the end of last session. 5 years later in the month of Adar, which is late February to us, in 515 BC, that's when the temple was finally rebuilt and dedicated to the service of the Lord again. 5 years after Haggai comes into the land. But here's the promise. And this is an important promise, given the situation in Judah and Jerusalem. Look at this. It's not much of a promise. If you look at it and think of the promises we've gone through, you may wonder, this doesn't seem like much. It's huge. God is speaking to the people in the book of Haggai after the temple is on its way to being built, and they've seen the foundation laid of the temple, and it's not nearly the size of the temple that Solomon built. It's a mini temple. And God asks the question of Israel, who is left among you? Because there were some old people. 70 years isn't a terribly long period of time. And there were some people who had left Israel with the exile to Babylon, who returned to Jerusalem. They were old men and women, but God asked the question, who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? Who saw it when I had Solomon build it? And here's God's second question, and how do you see it now? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison to Solomon's temple? If you'll read these Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, you'll see that the people were weeping. The older people were weeping when the temple was built, because it wasn't anything like the one obviously the shape, the structure, the 60 by 60, but the ratios of it were the same. But in splendor, it wasn't close to that golden, gorgeous temple that Solomon had built. And God says, does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? Some of the old people were weeping when they saw this temple, not weeping for joy, weeping because what happened to the gloriousness of our temple, while others were cheering, the younger crowd was cheering. But this is what God says, but now take courage, Zerubbabel, declares Yahweh. Take courage also, Yeshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and all you people of the land, take courage, declares Yahweh, and work. Finish this. And here's the promise, I am with you. And you think, what is so important about God being with them? Look at what it says in the next verse. As for the promise which I made when you came out of Egypt, my Spirit is abiding in your midst. Do not fear. Why, again, is this an important promise? Because the Jewish nation, understand the history of it. What has just occurred to Jews in Israel and especially in Judah? The Jewish nation was all but completely destroyed by Yahweh. The northern kingdom hasn't been in the land of Israel for 220 years. America is not much older than that. 220 years Israel was kicked out of their land, the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom has been out of the land for almost 70 years. And now that they're starting to trickle back into the land, the Jews are downtrodden. The Jews are wondering of their relationship with Yahweh. What is our relationship with this God going to be? After all, He evicted us from the land for disobedience. What do we have in store in our relationship with Yahweh? These are all questions that these Jews would have been asking. What will it be like when we go back to Jerusalem? Will we have the strength to rebuild the temple? Where will we get the money to rebuild the temple? How are these things going to take place? And here we have Yahweh personally reassuring the Judeans, I will protect you, I will defend you, and I will provide for my temple. You go back and do what I tell you to do. I am with you. The promise that I made to Abraham didn't stop. The Abrahamic covenant, the promise of a land, a seed, and a blessing is still perfectly in play. My plan is continuing to roll forward. This is the reassurance of God in this chapter in Haggai. I will be the God. I've always been the same God. It's you people that changed. The promise I made to Abraham doesn't stop. The promise I made to David in 2 Samuel doesn't stop. There will be an eternal Jewish king on David's throne. By the time you get to the end of Haggai, chapter 2, there's only 2 chapters. About verse 23, he says some things about Zerubbabel. Speaking of a signet ring on Zerubbabel's finger, speaking of this ultimate king of Israel who would one day come. He speaks of this eternal millennial glory, this promise of the Davidic kings that will continue. So the promise that Israel doesn't have to fear, God is still there. It's giant to them. It's giant. It's giant in their understanding that God will still protect, defend, and provide for them in the land of Canaan, just like before. Come back home, and I'll take care of you. A couple of facts about this book, Haggai, before we go into it. It's the second shortest book in the Old Testament. That should make some of you like it just right off the bat. The shortest book in the Old Testament is the book of Obadiah, which has 440 words. Haggai has a few more. So those are your top two, Obadiah and Haggai. Just as an aside, what about the New Testament? Anybody know shortest book of the New Testament? Keep guessing. I'll tell you if you were right. Who said 3 John? He just keeps throwing them out. It's 3 John. 3 John is the shortest book in the New Testament. 219 Greek words. 3 John, or 2 John is next. Haggai. This prophet Haggai. His name comes from the Hebrew word Hag, C-H-A-G, Hag, which means festival, festive, or a festival. The feast days of Israel are called Hag. Shamech Hag, you may see people say, happy festival, happy feast day. The Jews still say this to each other. So his name means either festive or festival, and I wonder if it's a foreshadowing of the idea that once the temple is rebuilt, Israel will be free and able to go back and celebrate their wonderful Jewish feasts and festivals. The man's name means festive. In the book of Haggai, this tiny little book, 2 chapters long, God sends 4 very specific messages through this prophet. 4 distinct messages through him, and they all take place, all 4 of the messages, this little bitty book, takes place in the year 520 BC. Remember the timeline, 520, that's the year that Haggai and Zechariah will go back into the land. All 4 of these messages are given by God in the reign of Dariavish in 520 BC. That Bible word, Dariavish, looks like Darius, but the Hebrews would pronounce it Dariavish. That was the king's name, Dariavish. This book, a couple more facts. Haggai speaks of the message, that his message is directly from Yahweh. He says this in 2 short chapters 25 times, thus says the Lord. Make no mistake, these aren't my words. He had a pretty strong message for Israel to get back to work. And he says 25 times, this is what the Lord Almighty says. And then he'll give them the message and he'll close it with, declares the Lord Almighty. 25 times. He's absolutely focused on the fact that he is a servant of the living God and is speaking the words of God himself. Not his words. It's not his message. It's God's message, and he lets everybody know it 25 times. And one more fact before we get into this. He's the first man that Yahweh uses to speak to the post-exilic Jewish community. You think of the prophets that spoke during the exile, Ezekiel, Daniel, but after the exile, when Israel started going back to the land, Haggai was the one that God used to break the silence. He was the first prophet that God used to speak to Israel post-exile, after that 70-year period kicked out of Israel. So soon, Zechariah will join Haggai. They both are a team in Jerusalem trying to get the Jews to start rebuilding the temple again. I want to show you a couple of slides here. In Ezra, let me say this too. When you read Haggai, when you read Zechariah, when you read Ezra, you're going to be tripping over all the same facts, all the same names, because they all happened, if you remember that timeline, all in the same periods of time. So Ezra speaks of Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai speaks of Zechariah and Ezra. They all speak of each other, written at the same time. But look at this from Ezra chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Concerning when these 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, when the prophets, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them, then Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Yeshua the son of Yodsadak arose and began to rebuild the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. The prophets of God with them and supporting them is a little light. They were kicking them along, making sure that they continued the work. But you see all the players here in Ezra, in Nehemiah, in Haggai, in Zechariah. They're all here in this verse. The 2 prophets, Zerubbabel, who will be the governor, who is in the line of the Savior Jesus Christ. He is Davidic. He is the man on the scene. He is the promised Davidic seed who God is continuing to let Israel know the Davidic seed, the Davidic promise continues. Zerubbabel is in the line of King David. He was not named the king of Israel after this, but he is in the line of King David. You can see his name in the genealogies of Jesus, both in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, Zerubbabel. And then the other person of interest is Yeshua. Interesting. Remember what I told you, all the things that have happened in Israel. What's it going to be like in Jerusalem? What's our relationship with Yahweh going to be like? Will we have the strength to rebuild the temple? How are we going to pay for the rebuilding of the temple? And God has it so that the high priest of the land is named Yeshua. God saves. The promise is reiterated through these names that God puts on these pages here. Yeshua, the same name for Jesus, same name for Joshua, slight difference, Yehoshua. God saves, Yahweh saves, in order to let the people, encourage them and remind them that the plan of God continues. You're back in the land. We're back at it. We're back at it. So I want to ask this question and start to answer it. Why would Yahweh, I started with this, I asked the question, we're going to look at a couple of verses. Why would Yahweh have to send these two prophets into the land, to Jerusalem, to get the building of the temple started again? What stalled the building of the temple? Why did the Jews stop building it?
They wanted to build their own house.
Yes, that's part of the reason. That's a big part of the reason. We'll get to that probably next Wednesday. Give me another reason. Can you think of any entity, anything that's been created by God who may want to stop the worship center of Yahweh himself from being rebuilt in Jerusalem? Who would want the temple not to be rebuilt in Jerusalem? The haters of Israel, the haters of the Jews, the king of which is who? Satan himself. Look at what the scripture says. I want you to turn to this verse. Turn to Ezra chapter 5 with me. Right after 2 Chronicles, Ezra. Let's read a few verses here. Teresa is right. The Jews lost focus the way they do. You expect these Jews after the 70 years in Babylon to come back and just be perfect, obedient folks, but unfortunately they're not. And the Jews lost focus on the temple project, and they were building their own houses. We'll get to that. But another problem was Satan was throwing wrenches in the way, and that's exactly what happens here in Ezra chapter 5. Look what Ezra says. At that time, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, this river is the Euphrates. So we have a problem that rears his ugly head. His name is Tatnai. At that time, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shtar-Bozenai, this other guy, and their colleagues, so you've got two men leading the group, Tatnai and Shtar-Bozenai, and they and their colleagues came to them, the Jews who were building the building, and they spoke to them thus: who issued you a decree to rebuild this temple and to finish this structure? What's the implication? You can't do what you're doing. You don't have the authority to rebuild this temple. We are the Persian Empire. And are you trying to build an empire here in Judah? So you have these men who are Persian officials looking out for the interests of the Persian Empire and the Persian king Darius. And so they are trying to stop these Jews. This question, who gave you the authority to build this building, is them trying to stop the building of the temple. Now, of course, they work for the king of the empire, but I would ask the question, who ultimately are they working for? Who wants to stop the building of Yahweh's temple? It's the devil. It's the devil. The battle is always raging between Yahweh and Satan. Don't lose sight of that. And don't lose sight of this fact: anti-Semitism, the hatred for the Jew, is always part of the battle. Satan's battle with God is always focused on anti-Semitism. They're a hated people. Jerusalem is a hated city. And Yahweh is a hated God. Verse 4 says this: we told them, the Jews answered, we told them according to what the names of the men who were reconstructing this building. This will explain itself more in a couple of verses. So these men, Tatnai and the other guy and their colleagues, are having conversation with the Jews who are building the buildings. You know, it's interesting. By the time Nehemiah comes back, anti-Semitism is so strong in Israel, and the oppression and the violence from other people is so strong, not wanting to Jerusalem to be rebuilt. You know how they built? You know how the men in Nehemiah's day built the wall? With one hand on a weapon to defend themselves, and the other hand building the wall. Who doesn't want the city of Jerusalem rebuilt? What's his name? Satan. And so he attacks Israel, still attacking them today. And yes, you're absolutely right, Dale. One hand on a weapon and the other hand building the wall. So here we have these two people in Ezra's day, 70, 60, 70 years before Nehemiah. And here we have Satan sending men in to stop the rebuilding of the temple. You don't have the authority in the Persian Empire to build this building. But look what it says in verse 5. But the eye of their God, that's Yahweh, we're speaking of the Jewish men building, but the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until a report could come to Dariavish the king, and then a written reply be returned concerning it. You've got Haggai and Zechariah encouraging the building of the temple. We won't stop for anything. Not again. You can check with the king. And that's what happens here. Look at what it says in verse 6. This is the copy of the letter which Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, and Shtar-Bozenai and his colleagues, the officials who were beyond the river, sent to Dariavish the king. The Jews said, you can check it. And so they said, we will check it because you're lying to us. If they would have believed the Jews, they wouldn't have to send a letter to the king. They did not believe the Jews had authority. Verse 7 says, they sent a report to him, to the king, in which it was written thus. And now we have this historical record recorded in the scripture. This letter was penned. It says, to Dariavish the king, all peace. Let it be known to the king that we have gone to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. What's that house called? The temple, which is being built. I love the grandness of the words here, which is being built with huge stones. And beams are being laid in the walls, and this work is going on with great care and is succeeding in their hands. Haggai and Zechariah are pushing these crews, and the work is getting done. The worship temple for the service of Yahweh, the God of Israel, is being built successfully, and these two men want it to stop. King, this is not in your best interest that these people should be building this temple. And then we asked those elders, in verse 8, look what it says. We asked those elders, and we said to them thus, who issued you a decree to rebuild this temple and to finish this structure? They're writing this letter to the king. This is what went on. We need you to decide this. We also asked them their names. Isn't that what you do? You get the names of people, because when you're about to tell the authorities someone's name, all of a sudden they get scared. They don't want to give you their name. What do the Jews do? Backed by the encouragement of Haggai and Zechariah, they give them their names. We asked them their names so as to inform you that we might write down the names of the men who were at their head. Thus they answered us, saying, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, Creator God, only God, God who created you, Tatnai. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, with which a great king of Israel built and finished. What was his name? Solomon. But, and it's wonderful that the Jews understand this. Why are we having to rebuild the temple that our great King Solomon built many years ago? And look what it says in verse 12. But because our fathers, our Jewish fathers, had provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. What year did that happen? What year did Nebuchadnezzar destroy the city? Burn down the temple? 586 BC. This is when Israel finally went into exile, into captivity in Babylon. Verse 13, the letter continues. Tatnai and the other guy are writing to the king saying, this is our conversation. This is what the Jews said. King, we want you to check them. They're liars. We don't believe it. The Jews are telling this. They're writing the letter. These other guys are. Verse 13, however, they say, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild the house of God, 538 BC, on our timeline. This is what the Jews are explaining to this group of men who want them to stop building. Not only did Cyrus in 538 say we could go back and build the temple, but look what it says, also the gold and silver utensils of the temple, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, brought them to the temple of Babylon. These gold and silver utensils Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon, and they were given to one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he appointed governor. This is a Jew. Went back with Zerubbabel. So Cyrus not only said, go back to the land and rebuild God's temple, Cyrus said, and take all this gold and silver, all the things that were stolen from the temple, you take them back and restore them to the service of Yahweh, your God. He said to them, take these utensils, go and deposit them in the temple in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt in its place. There's only one place on earth that temple can be built, and that's on Mount Moriah, on the Temple Mount. Same place where Abraham offered Isaac to the Lord. Same place where David went to the threshing floor of Araunah, and the killing was stopped in Israel. A place they call Mount Zion. It's all the same place. It is the Temple Mount. And Cyrus understood it. Let the house of God be rebuilt in its place. And it goes on in verse 16. Then that Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God. It started well. He came and he laid the foundations of the house of God in Jerusalem. And from then until now it has been under construction, and it is not yet complete. And so this is their request. They finally get to the point. They've told the king the story. This is what they want. Stop the work. It says, now if it pleases the king, let a search be conducted in the king's treasure house, which is there in Babylon, if it be that a decree was issued by King Cyrus. Now, why would they ask that question? If they believed the Jews, we're done. Cyrus said we could do it. Please leave and let us get back to work. They obviously don't believe the Jews, or else they wouldn't be sending this letter and asking the king to look in the royal records and let's prove the Jews liars. So you check it, see if it be that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to rebuild this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send to us his decision concerning this matter. We put it in your hands, king, to stop the building of this temple, because you're not going to find this letter. So the king issued a decree. You can't read the rest of it, but the king issues a decree. He has the royal treasure house searched to look for this letter from Cyrus, Cyrus's decree to rebuild the temple. And what do you think he found? Exactly that. But isn't it interesting what we see here? This King Dariavish, he finds the decree issued by Cyrus, and he sent this word back to the Gentile haters of Israel, Tatnai and his colleagues. In Ezra verse 6, or chapter 6, verse 6 and 7, I have some of these on the board because we shift out of that chapter, but this is what it says in Ezra 6, 6 and 7. This is the response back from the king. You wanted some information from me? You're not going to like how I respond. Now therefore, Tatnai, governor of the province beyond the river, Shtar-bozenai, and your colleagues, the officials of the provinces beyond the river, keep away from there. Who is in control of his Temple Mount? God is. And when men come picking around and pecking around and say the Jews don't own this, the Jews don't have authority here, the Jews don't have a right, God speaks, and He has men tell others, haters of His people, you leave my place alone. Keep away from there. What else does it say in verse 7? Leave this work on the house of God alone. You turn tail and run. You've got no business there with the people of Yahweh, the God, the Creator God of the universe. You leave there. You leave the work of the house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Who owns the Temple Mount? The Jews do. God has given that space to Israel. What's on the Temple Mount today? What is exactly where Solomon's temple and where Zerubbabel's temple that was later redesigned and expanded by Herod the Great? What is on that Temple Mount, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, the threshing floor of Arunah? What's there right now? The Islamic heresy called the Dome of the Rock. And right beside it, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's run by Satan. But who owns that dirt? God does. And who will one day take that dirt back and give it to the Jews so they can rebuild the temple? Yes, the very same God who's speaking to these men, you get away from my Temple Mount, I own that. I'll decide what goes on there, not you people. And he has this Dariavish, the king Darius, this man go into the record book and find exactly what Cyrus had said. You get away from there. Talk about poking a sleeping bear in the person of God. And that's bad for these Tatnai and his friends, but the king continues. Not just stay away from there, but look what else he says. You know what you get for poking around in the wrong place, a place you don't belong, a place you have no business poking? You get to pay for it. I just love the strength of God. I love the turn. I love the way God does things. He's just so magnificent, isn't he? Ezra 6:8 says, moreover, Cyrus issued a decree, my turn. Dariavish says, I issue a decree concerning what you are to do for these elders of Judah in the rebuilding of this house of God. You wanted to stop it, but you're going to have responsibilities now. Let's not forget who the king of the Persian Empire is. The full cost. Can you imagine how hard these men swallowed when they read this letter? The full cost is to be paid to these people, the Jews, from the royal treasury out of the taxes of the provinces beyond the river. Your tax income is going to go to rebuild that temple you hate, for that God you hate, for that people you hate. You're going to fund it. What a God. Only God can make a change like this. So going to be paid for from the royal treasury out of the taxes of the provinces beyond the river, and that without delay. Right now, open up your coffers. Ezra 6, 9, and 10, look what it says here. Whatever is needed. Not just the building. God continues on through Dariavish, continues providing for Israel, having come back into the land, rebuilding his worship site. Whatever is needed, both young bulls, rams, lambs for a burnt offering to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, anointing oil as the priests in Jerusalem request. It's to be given to them daily without fail. The king has spoken. That they may offer acceptable sacrifices to the God of heaven. And look at this, and pray for the life of the king and his sons. I asked you last time, we're going to stop right in here somewhere. I asked you last time, why is it that a king like Cyrus would allow these other people like the Jews to go back and set up a worship center to a God that Cyrus doesn't worship? Why would he do that? There's your clue right there. This is King Darius, but this is the way these people thought. The more temples, the better. Only when you pray to your God, pray for my life and my son's life. You see, I'm going to show you a verse or a quote here. I told you that they have found historically, archaeologically, they have this little bitty thing called the Cyrus cylinder. It's from 538 BC. That's the year that Cyrus made the decree for Israel to go back and start rebuilding the temple. And this is on the Cyrus cylinder. These are his historic words. Why would he send Israel back to rebuild a temple to a God he doesn't know or worship? And on this cylinder it says, "May all the gods whom I have resettled in their sacred cities, like Jerusalem, may they daily ask Baal and Nebo for a long life for me." Thinking that the gods are in communion with each other and related to each other and speak to each other, Cyrus wanted Yahweh to put in a good word for him with his false gods, Baal and Nebo. You see the idea? What's wrong with having another god? They worship dozens and dozens of gods, their pantheon. So one more was great, as long as you get him to talk to my gods to give me long life. Darius wanted long life not only for himself but also for his sons. I want to take you one other place to show you that this hatred of Israel is ongoing. Look at Ezra chapter 4. In Ezra chapter 4, there's a break in the chronology for several verses. And it goes into the future. And it speaks of hatred of Israel. It gives two examples of hostility in Nehemiah's day, which is coming future. But look what it says in Ezra 4:12 concerning the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. What I'm saying is this anti-Semitism isn't anything new. It wasn't just in Ezra's day. It wasn't just in Haggai and Zechariah's day with these two guys trying to write a letter to Darius to stop the building. 60, 70 years later, it was still in force. Look what it says in Ezra chapter 4, verse 12. Let it be known to the king, this is King Artaxerxes, totally different king, further down in history. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to, this is Nehemiah's group, have come up to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and evil city. Hated people, hated city, hated temple, hated God. Look at what they call Jerusalem, the evil and rebellious city, and are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now let it be known to the king that if that city is rebuilt, Jerusalem, and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute. They're not going to pay their taxes. They won't pay their custom or their toll, and it will damage the revenue of the kings. What do they want done? They just don't want the Jews resettled in the land. They don't want the Jews in Jerusalem. There's a whole group of people in this world that don't want the Jews settled in their land, and they don't want the Jews in Jerusalem. Nothing new under the sun. Listen, it's interesting. Look at what it says after that in verse 14. Now, because we are in the service at the palace, it's not fitting for us to see the king's dishonor. See, they're only looking out for the king. It's not about we hate Israel, we hate the Jew, we hate their God, we hate their temple. It's about taking care of the kingdom. It's not fitting for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king. Look, here we go again. So that a search be made in the record books of your fathers, and you will discover in the record books and learn that this city is a rebellious city and damaging to kings and provinces. and that they have incited revolt within it in past days. Therefore, that city was laid waste. Their history is wrong. The city was laid waste, but why? Who did they revolt against? Against their God Yahweh. That was their problem. But the history has been messed with here. And so there's, again, later in time, still hating the Jews, the same line of all the hatred, and they're going to the king and saying, we've got to stop. Just like Ezra tried, or just like we tried in Ezra's day to get the temple to stop rebuilt, we need to get this city stop being rebuilt because it's a pariah. It'll destroy your empire, king. How many nations on earth today, there's no number, none of us would know the number, but how many nations today would make tomorrow a national holiday if Israel could only be destroyed tonight? Have no idea what the number is, but it's a big number. It's a big number. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Let's close.